There are moments in a person's life so brutal, so publicly humiliating, that they either shatter the soul entirely or forge something unbreakable in its place. What happened on the sun-scorched platform of Red Hollow Creek in the summer of 1878 was exactly that kind of moment. A woman arrived with nothing but a worn suitcase and a quiet, stubborn hope. A man watched from the shadows with a heart so armored he had forgotten it could still bleed. And a town full of small, cruel people had no idea they were about to witness something they would never fully understand. Stay with this story until the very end, because what begins in shame ends in something far more powerful than any of them deserved. The train came in at 2:30 in the afternoon, sliding into Red Hollow Creek, the way everything unwelcome arrived in that town without ceremony, and trailing a cloud of grit that settled on every surface it touched. The platform was already crowded, the way it always was when the eastbound stopped, because in a town with so little to talk about, strangers arriving on trains were a form of entertainment. Men leaned against the weathered posts with their thumbs hooked in their suspenders and their eyes squinting against the glare. Women gathered in clusters, their bonnets tilted toward one another, their mouths already moving before anyone had stepped off the cars. The heat in Red Hollow Creek in July was not merely hot. It was a living thing, thick and pressing, the kind of heat that made a body feel as though the air itself had weight. The sky above the platform was a pale, washed-out blue, bleached almost white, near the horizon, and the dust that rose from the unpaved street beyond the depot hung in the air like a fine mist that never quite settled. A dog lay stretched in the narrow stripe of shade beneath the station bench, its ribs rising and falling with labored slowness. Even the flies seemed half-hearted in their buzzing. Clara Voss stepped down from the third car, carrying a brown leather suitcase that had seen better decades. She was 27 years old, and she had traveled for 4 days on 2 trains and a coach line to reach this place, this particular square of scorched earth in the Arizona territory that was supposed to be the beginning of her new life. Her dress was a deep blue cotton that had faded somewhat at the shoulders from too much sun on the journey west, and her dark hair was pinned with the meticulous care of a woman who understands that dignity is sometimes all you have left to hold on to. She was not what fashion magazines of the era would have called slender. She was full-figured and strong-shouldered, built in the way of women who worked with their hands, and there was in her bearing a quietness that was not timidity, but something closer to patience. The patience of a person who has learned that most battles are won by simply remaining standing. She stepped onto the platform and set her suitcase down beside her and looked out at the crowd with a gaze that was steady and unhurried, and she searched the assembled faces for the man whose letter had brought her here. His name was Edmund Pryor, and he had been corresponding with her through the matrimonial agency in Philadelphia for nearly 4 months. His letters had been formal, but not unkind. He had written that he owned 40 acres north of town, that he needed a capable woman to manage a household, and that he was a serious man looking for a serious woman who understood the practical nature of frontier marriage. Clara had understood exactly what he meant. She had not come west looking for romance. She had come west looking for a door that would finally open, because every door in her former life had been pressed shut against her by the weight of other people's opinions, most of them belonging to her own family. She spotted Edmund Pryor before he spotted her. He was standing near the end of the platform, a lean man in his mid-40s with a sun-reddened face and the kind of eyes that were always measuring something. He was dressed in his best, which told her he understood the gravity of the occasion: a clean cotton shirt, dark trousers, boots that had been wiped if not polished. He had his hat in his hand, and he was scanning the disembarking passengers with an expression of strained anticipation. Then he found her. She watched it happen. She watched the anticipation drain out of his face, the way water drains from a cracked basin, slowly at first, and then all at once. His eyes moved over her once, then again, with the deliberate assessment of a man examining livestock at auction, She felt that look the way you feel a slap you see coming but cannot stop braced for it and wounded by it anyway. She picked up her suitcase and walked toward him because there was nowhere else to walk. "Mr. Pryor," she said, "I am Clara Voss." He did not offer his hand. He simply stood there for a moment that stretched well past the bounds of common decency and the crowd on the platform sensing something about to happen. With the animal instinct crowds have, for spectacle began to quiet and draw in slightly. "The agency," Edmund Pryor said at last, and his voice carried clearly in the hot, still air, "said nothing about this." "I beg your pardon." Her voice was calm. She had learned very young how to keep her voice calm. "I paid good money for passage and for the agency's fee," he said, and now he was not speaking only to her, but to the assembled crowd, as though he wanted witnesses to whatever grievance he was about to air. The letter said capable and pleasant-looking. That was the representation I was given. "I am both of those things," Clara said. Someone in the crowd laughed. It was a short, hard sound, and it was immediately joined by others. "You are not," Edmund Pryor said, and now his voice had risen to match his audience. "What was advertised? I wrote asking for a helpmeet, not this." He gestured at her with a contemptuous wave of his hand, the kind of gesture a man makes when words seem insufficient for his disdain. "Damaged goods, that is what they have sent me. Damaged goods and oversized ones at that, and I will not be having it." The words landed in Clara's chest like stones thrown from a height. She stood completely still. Her hand tightened on the handle of her suitcase until she could feel the worn leather ridges pressing into her palm, and she focused on that sensation with a precision that was almost surgical, because it was the one thing in that moment that was purely physical and therefore manageable. The burning behind her eyes she could deal with later. The hollow, spreading sensation in her sternum she could deal with later. Right now there was only the suitcase handle and the platform boards beneath her feet, and the need to remain upright. She had heard these words before, not these exact words, but words that lived in the same family of cruelty. She had heard them first at her mother's kitchen table, delivered in quieter tones, but with no less precision. "You are plain, Clara. You are plain, and you are difficult to love, and you should be grateful for whatever you are offered, because you will not be offered much." She had heard variations of this assessment from her two older sisters, from the women at her church, from the man she had briefly hoped might court her at 23 before he thought better of it and chose someone prettier and less complicated. The voice of her family's disappointment in her had been so consistent, so unvarying across the years, that she had come to hear it even in silence. But she had never before heard it shouted on a public platform while 30 people stood and watched. A woman near the station door made a sound of gleeful sympathy that was entirely performative. A man in a leather vest said something to his companion that produced an appreciative snicker. A young girl stared at Clara with open, uncomplicated curiosity until her mother pulled her away. Edmund Pryor was still speaking. He was addressing the crowd now more than he was addressing her, cataloging his grievances with the enthusiasm of a man who has found a sympathetic audience. He spoke about the money he had paid. He spoke about the reasonable expectations a man had when corresponding through a reputable agency. He spoke about the particular cruelty of being sent a woman so far below his specifications when he had been clear, perfectly clear, about what he required. Clara let him finish. She stood with her suitcase at her side and her spine straight, and she let him finish, and when he had exhausted his list of complaints, she said quietly but without apology, "I see that we have both been disappointed today, Mr. Pryor." She picked up her suitcase with both hands and turned away from him. There was nowhere to go. That was the reality that settled over her as she stood with her back to Edmund Pryor, and her face pointed at the street beyond the depot. She had 32 cents in her purse. She had no return ticket. The agency in Philadelphia had been paid by Edmund Pryor, which meant there was no intermediary to appeal to, no institutional mechanism that might correct this situation. She was in a town she did not know, in a territory she had never visited, with a suitcase 32 cents and the particular freedom that comes from having absolutely nothing left to lose. The crowd on the platform had not dispersed. Crowds never disperse when something interesting is still happening, and Clara Voss, standing alone with her suitcase on the platform of Red Hollow Creek, was apparently still something interesting. She could feel their eyes on her back with a physical heaviness, and beneath that sensation was the deep, familiar undertow of the voice that said, "This is what you deserve. This is what you have always deserved. You came here thinking you could start again, and what a foolish, vain thing that was to think." She breathed. She had learned to breathe in the particular way a person learns when breathing is the only tool they have. In through the nose, slowly, until the lungs were full. Out through the mouth steadily, until they were empty. Again. And in the breathing she found the narrow ledge of composure she needed to think. The immediate problems were concrete, and therefore solvable in theory. She needed shelter before nightfall. She needed food. She needed, eventually, a way to earn enough money to get somewhere else. Though where that somewhere else might be was a question she could not yet afford to entertain. The frontier was not known for its charity toward solitary women of no means, and she harbored no illusions about the difficulty of what she was facing. But she had come from nothing before. She had spent 27 years building a life out of the scraps other people left her, and she could do it again. What she could not do was stand on this platform forever. She turned to face the crowd, and something in her expression, some combination of exhaustion and defiance, and a dignity so quiet it had to be looked for, caused a few of the more honest onlookers to shift their weight and glance away. She was preparing to ask, with whatever grace she could muster, whether there was a boarding house in town that might extend her credit, when the crowd did something unexpected. It moved. Not the gradual dispersal of a crowd losing interest, but a sharp collective parting, the way water splits around a stone. People stepped back. Men who had been leaning comfortably against posts straightened suddenly. The laughter went out of the crowd the way a candle goes out in a draught all at once, and completely, and in the space it left behind was something else, something that lived lower in the body than amusement, something older and more honest. Fear. She turned to find its source, and she found Silas Kane. He came from the far end of the platform, and the first thing she understood about him, before she had registered any detail of his face or form, was that the crowd was afraid of him. Not the performative wariness people show toward men who merely carry themselves with authority, but something genuine and animal, the instinctive response of smaller creatures to the approach of something large and dangerous and indifferent to the rules that govern normal human exchange. He was tall in the way that could not be attributed to boots or posture, simply built on a scale that most men were not, with shoulders that squared themselves beneath a worn canvas coat, and hands that hung at his sides with a stillness that was somehow more unsettling than movement. His face was not the face of a villain from a dime novel, not cartoonishly menacing or dramatically scarred. It was a hard face, a face that had been outdoors in sun and wind and cold for a long time and had stopped accommodating any of it. There was a scar that ran from his left cheekbone to the line of his jaw. Pale and settled in the way of old scars, and his eyes were a gray so dark they read as nearly black in the flat afternoon light, and they moved over the scene with a calm, unhurried attention that seemed to take in everything and require nothing in return. He stopped. He looked at Clara. He looked at the suitcase. He looked at the space Edmund Pryor had left when he had retreated predictably toward the back of the crowd the moment Silas appeared. He looked at Clara again. The crowd was holding its collective breath. Silas Kane said nothing for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was low, not the theatrical baritone of a man performing authority, but the natural register of someone whose voice had never needed to be raised to be heard. "I have a cabin up on the ridge," he said. "Place needs someone to cook and keep the dust out. I need it done. You need a roof. That's the situation. It's a job. Nothing more than that." Clara looked at him. She had spent a lifetime reading rooms and reading people, learning to hear what was underneath what was said and what she heard underneath. These words was not kindness exactly, but a kind of blunt transactional honesty that she had not encountered on the platform today and found in this moment more bracing than any comfort she could have been offered. He was not rescuing her. He was presenting a business arrangement. He was, in fact, offering her precisely what she had come west to find in the first place, a position, a purpose, a way to keep herself from starving while she figured out the rest. She looked at his hands and then at his face, and she found nothing in either that she could not account for. "What are the hours?" she asked. Something shifted very slightly in the dark eyes. Not quite a surprise. Something quieter than surprise. "Sun up to when the work is done," he said, "and the pay to room and board," he said, "and $1 a week when I have it." She considered this for 2 seconds, which was as much time as she could reasonably afford. Then she picked up her suitcase. "I accept," she said. The sound that moved through the crowd was not quite a murmur, and not quite a gasp. It was the sound of collective disbelief compressed and expelled from 30 bodies simultaneously. A woman near Clara said in a stage whisper, pitched precisely to be heard, "She will not last a fortnight." A man made a sound that was meant to be sympathetic, but landed as contemptuous. Edmund Pryor, from the safety of the crowd's back rows, said something she chose not to hear. Silas Kane did not acknowledge any of it. He simply turned and walked back the way he had come, and Clara, who was 27 years old and had 32 cents and nowhere else on earth to go, followed him. The wagon was a working man's wagon, heavy and plain and functional, the boards of the bed worn smooth by years of hauling things that needed hauling. The horse was a big roan with a calm, considered eye, who showed no particular interest in Clara as she climbed up to the bench. Silas took the reins without offering her a hand up, not from rudeness, she thought, but from a simple absence of the social instinct that prompted such gestures. She did not require a hand up. She climbed, settled herself, and placed her suitcase between her feet. He clucked to the horse, and they moved out of the depot yard and into the street. Red Hollow Creek had the particular quality of frontier towns in that everything in it seemed to exist in its first and most utilitarian form, as though the builders had answered only the immediate questions and left the refinements for later generations who had not yet arrived. The buildings along the main street were mostly board and batten, some with false fronts that made them appear taller than they were, and between them the street was an unpaved dirt track that the afternoon wind was currently populating with small, quick spirals of dust. A general store, a saloon with its doors standing open, a smithy sending the smell of hot iron out into the afternoon, a church at the far end of the street whose whitewash had gone gray. People stopped to watch them pass. Clara noticed this with a detached attention, the way you notice weather as a fact rather than a judgment. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes forward, and she let the town observe her departure with whatever satisfaction it needed to take from the spectacle. They had cleared the last building and were climbing a packed dirt track that wound up toward the ridge before Silas spoke again. "You don't have to stay," he said. "If you've got somewhere else to go, say so now." "I don't," Clara said. He nodded a single economical motion. "Then we understand each other." "I believe we do," she said. The track narrowed as it climbed, pressing between stands of juniper and pinon pine that grew thinly on the rocky slope, their roots reaching into cracks in the red stone with a tenacity that Clara found privately admirable. The light was beginning to shift toward the amber of late afternoon, and the valley below was softening in it, the harsh edges of the town blurring into something almost picturesque from a sufficient height and distance. She could smell the juniper on the air, clean and astringent, and nothing at all like Philadelphia. She thought about Edmund Pryor's face. She thought about his voice carrying across the platform, about the laughter of the crowd, about the particular quality of the shame she had felt standing there so familiar in its shape that she had been almost disappointed by its lack of originality. She had thought in her more hopeful moments on the train heading west that she was leaving that particular variety of pain behind her, that the world out here would be too busy surviving to spend its energy on cruelty. She had been, it appeared, optimistic. But she was still here. She was still upright. She was in a wagon going up a ridge with a man the town was afraid of toward a cabin that needed cleaning, and she had 32 cents and a job, and the sun was still in the sky. She had worked with less. The cabin appeared around a bend in the track without announcing itself, set in a shallow clearing where the slope leveled briefly before rising again. It was solidly built, she noted immediately, the logs chinked properly, and the roof not yet showing the sag that meant structural trouble. But it had been lived in for a long time by a man alone, and everything about it showed this. The porch board on the left side had cracked and heaved from repeated freezing. The single window facing the track was filmed with grime. A pile of split wood stood beside the door in something that had once been a stack and had since migrated into a heap. A rusted bucket sat where it had been put down and not picked up again. Silas brought the wagon to a stop and climbed down without comment, moving to unhitch the roan with the practice of a man for whom this was among the most routine of actions. Clara climbed down herself and stood with her suitcase and looked at the cabin. It was work. She could see the work it would take in the way that a person who has always worked looks at things and sees not the current state but the achievable state underneath it. The porch board could be replaced, the window could be cleaned, the wood could be restacked. The interior, which she had not yet seen but could imagine from the exterior, was another matter, but not an impossible one. She thought of her family's house in Pennsylvania, of the way her mother had kept the kitchen, of the satisfaction Clara had always found in the management of physical space, the ordering of things, the transformation of chaos into function. She had not been valued for this at home, not explicitly, but she had done it nonetheless, and she had done it well, and she could do it here. She walked up to the cabin door, and after a moment's pause that was less about seeking permission and more about the simple acknowledgement that she was entering a space that had not been hers, opened it and went in. The interior was dim and close and smelled of old wood smoke and something less identifiable, the particular scent of a place where one person has lived alone for a very long time. There was a stone hearth against the back wall with a good iron hook for a pot, and a scattered heap of ash in the firebox. A plank table. 2 chairs, one of which had a back rail that was no longer attached at one end. A narrow iron bedstead in the corner. A set of rough shelves holding a sparse, disorganized collection of canned goods, a salt box, a tin of coffee, a bottle of something amber that was about 3/4 empty. Clara stood in the center of the room and turned slowly, taking inventory. She set her suitcase down by the door. Then she rolled up her sleeves and got to work. She swept first, working from the back wall toward the door with a broom she found propped in the corner, raising a quantity of dust that told her it had been some time since anyone had applied it to the floor. She swept the table down and the shelves. She organized the canned goods by what she could determine of their contents. She carried 2 trips of ash from the firebox out to a spot behind the cabin where it could be disposed of without causing trouble. She found a bucket that held its water, filled it at the pump beside the cabin, and used it and a rag she had in her suitcase for exactly such purposes to wash the window inside. The difference was immediate and considerable. Light came in. When Silas came in from settling the horse, she was washing the second shelf, and the room was already perceptibly different. He stood in the doorway for a moment, and she felt his attention move over the changed space without comment. And then he moved to the hearth and began laying a fire with the competent, unhurried movements of a man who has done this every evening for years. "There's food," he said. "Canned goods, salt pork on the cold shelf outside." "I saw," she said. "I'll make something." He nodded and went out again. She made supper that first night from the salt pork and 2 cans of beans, and the last of a sack of cornmeal she found behind the coffee tin. A simple meal, but a solid one, and she set it on the table while the fire was still good and the light was still enough to see by. Silas came in and sat and ate, without ceremony, without compliment, without complaint, and when he had finished, he carried his bowl to the dry sink and set it there. "The room," he said, nodding toward the interior, which now also contained Clara's suitcase, pushed neatly under the far end of the shelf unit. "I can sleep on the floor by the hearth," she said. "I have a blanket." He was quiet for a moment. "The loft," he said finally. There was a ladder at the back she had noted. She had not climbed it. "There's a pallet up there. It's yours." "Thank you," she said. He did not answer. He moved to the chair by the hearth, the one whose back rail was intact, and sat with his elbows on his knees and looked into the fire, and Clara began washing up and outside the territory. Darkness came down completely, and the coyotes began their nightly conversation in the distance, and the fire spoke its small, steady language in the hearth, and Red Hollow Creek was far enough away down the ridge that it might as well, for this hour at least, not exist at all. Clara washed the last dish and dried her hands on the cloth and looked at the man sitting by the fire, at the line of his shoulders and the hard planes of his face in the firelight, and the long, settled scar along his jaw, and she felt nothing she could have easily named. Not safety, exactly, not comfort, but something in the vicinity of solidity. The sense that the ground beneath her for this particular night would hold. She climbed the ladder to the loft and lay down on the pallet in her dress and pulled her blanket around her and listened to the fire below and the coyotes outside and the vast indifferent silence of the territory, and she thought not for the last time that summer that she had survived worse beginnings than this. She had survived worse beginnings than this. She was awake before the light. This was not unusual for Clara. She had spent most of her life rising in the dark, in the cold kitchen of her family's Pennsylvania house, moving quietly so as not to disturb anyone, making herself useful before anyone was awake to observe it, which had always seemed to her the safest way to exist in a house where her presence was tolerated rather than welcomed. Old habits do not die simply because you cross a territorial border. They travel with you in the same suitcase as everything else. She climbed down from the loft and found the cabin empty. The fire had burned to coals sometime in the night, and the morning air coming under the door was cool enough to raise the fine hair on her forearms. She rebuilt the fire with the methodical patience she brought to every physical task, laying the kindling, precisely coaxing the coals back to useful life. And when the flames were steady, she filled the coffee pot from the pump and set it on the hook, and went to see what could be made for breakfast from what the cabin afforded. She found Silas outside when she stepped around the corner to collect wood from the heap already splitting logs in the gray pre-dawn light, with the concentrated efficiency of a man who did not require the sun's permission to begin his day. He worked without gloves, and she noticed this because the morning was cold enough that her own breath was visible, and she filed the observation away without attaching a judgment to it. He did not acknowledge her immediately, only continued the work, the axe rising and falling with a rhythm that was almost meditative in its steadiness. "Coffee is on," she said. He nodded without breaking rhythm. She went back inside and made what she could from the available provisions: cornmeal mush from the last of the bag, and the salt pork sliced thin and fried in the pan she had found hanging behind the door. By the time Silas came in and set his coat on the peg, the coffee was poured and the food was on the table. And something about the scene, the steam rising from the cups, the smell of the frying pork, the simple domestic fact of a table laid for two seemed to catch him for just a moment at the threshold in a way that was quickly shuttered. He sat, he ate. He drank his coffee, standing after the meal, looking out the window at the ridge in the growing light. "I'll be working the east pasture today," he said. "There's a fence line that needs tending. I won't be back before dark." "I'll have supper ready," Clara said. He left without further conversation, and the sound of his boots on the path faded, and Clara was alone in the cabin for the first time since her arrival, and she stood in the middle of the room and took a full breath and let it out slowly, and thought about the work that needed doing. There was enough work to keep a person busy for a month. She started with the interior. The walls had never been whitewashed, which meant the logs themselves were the only surface, and while there was a frontier honesty to this that she respected, it also meant that every groove and seam between the logs had been accumulating dust and insect debris for what looked like several years. She worked with a stiff brush she fashioned from a bundle of juniper twigs, lashed with a strip of leather she found in a box under the dry sink, working along the walls systematically, section by section, driving out the accumulated grime of a long bachelorhood with a thoroughness that was almost personal in its intensity. She reorganized the shelves by logic rather than by accident, which was how they had previously been organized, grouping the canned goods by type, moving the coffee and the salt to the most accessible positions, creating a small cleared space on the second shelf where a lamp could sit and illuminate the work surface. She found the lamp itself under the table, a plain tin affair that had run dry, and made a note that lamp oil was needed, which meant a trip to town was needed, which was a thought she set aside for later consideration. She mended the chair with the broken back rail, using a length of rawhide she found coiled in the corner near the door, wrapping it tight and knotting it in a way she had learned from watching her father mend harness when she was very small, before the drinking had made him careless with his hands and everything else. The repair was not elegant, but it was solid, and when she pressed on the rail, it did not move. She was working on the porch board in the afternoon, having determined that the broken section needed to be removed entirely, rather than patched, when she heard the horse on the path. It was too early for Silas, and she looked up to find a boy of perhaps 12 picking his way up the track on a spotted pony, with the particular expression of a child who has been sent somewhere he is not entirely certain he wants to go. He pulled up at the edge of the clearing and looked at her with wide, conflicted eyes. "You the woman staying with Mr. Kane?" he asked. "I am," she said. She set down her tools and stood. "And you are Tommy Driscoll. My pa has the feed store." He held out a paper sack, extending it at arm's length, as though proximity to the cabin itself might be contagious. "My ma sent this. She said it wasn't Christian to let a stranger go without." He added, in a lower voice, as though confessing something she didn't tell Pa. Clara crossed the clearing and took the bag from the boy. It held a loaf of bread still warm and a small crock of something that turned out to be apple butter. She looked at it for a moment, and the simple, unexpected kindness of it moved through her chest with a warmth that surprised her by its force. "Please thank your mother for me," she said, "and tell her I said that her son has excellent manners." Tommy Driscoll flushed to the roots of his hair, yanked the pony's head around with the urgency of someone escaping a compliment, and clattered back down the track at a trot that suggested he would not be mentioning this visit to his father. Clara stood in the clearing with the bag and watched him go. She had the porch board replaced, or rather removed, and the gap covered with a length of plank she found behind the cabin by the time the sun began to lower and she went inside to start supper with the particular satisfaction of a person who has put in a full day of purposeful work. It was not a complicated feeling. It was one of the few feelings she had learned she could absolutely trust. She made a stew from the remaining salt pork and 4 cans of vegetables she found at the back of the shelf, adding the dried herbs she had brought in her suitcase because she had always traveled with dried herbs on the theory that a meal made with care tastes different from a meal made without it, which she believed to be literally true. She sliced the bread Tommy Driscoll's mother had sent and set the apple butter beside it. And when the fire was good and the stew was simmering with the low, steady sound of something that had been given enough time and heat to become properly itself, she sat at the table and rested her hands in her lap and simply breathed for a moment. Silas came in as the last light was leaving the sky. He moved through the door with the heaviness of a man whose body had done substantial work. And he stopped just inside, and his eyes went to the table, to the stew, to the bread, and then briefly to the chair with the mended back rail, and then to the walls and the reorganized shelves, and he was quiet long enough that Clara began to wonder if she had overstepped, if she had rearranged a space that was not hers to rearrange, if there were rules here she had not been told. "The porch," he said finally. "The left board was split through," she said. "I removed it. The replacement isn't as wide, but it will hold until a proper board can be cut." He looked at her for a moment. "Where did you find the plank?" "Behind the cabin, under the overhang." He nodded slowly. "I put that there 3 winters ago," he said, "meant to get to the porch." "I got to it," she said simply. He sat. He ate the stew with the same quiet efficiency he brought to every physical task, and about halfway through the bowl he stopped and looked at it, and then at her. "Herbs," he said, "dried thyme and a little rosemary. I had them in my case." Another long pause. "It's good, duh," he said. It came out with the slightly stiff quality of a man who does not often say such things, who has had so few occasions to offer them that the words have lost some of their ease. "Thank you," she said. They ate the rest of the meal without conversation, but it was a different quality of silence than the previous evening, less like the absence of words and more like the space where words might eventually be comfortable. Over the days that followed, Clara learned the rhythms of the ridge the way she had always learned the rhythms of places, through patient attention and the quiet accumulation of observation. She learned that Silas was up before dawn without exception, and did not return until the work demanded it, that he did not waste motion, that he kept his tools in the order of a man who had learned that disorder in the field cost time that might be critical. She learned that he did not talk during meals, but sometimes in the evenings. When the fire was going and the work was done, he would sit in the chair by the hearth, and a kind of stillness would come over him that was not quite sleep and not quite wakefulness, a resting of something deeper than the body. She learned that he was not a cruel man. This was the most significant thing she learned, and she learned it gradually from evidence, rather than from anything he said. She learned it from the way he treated the roan horse, which was with a matter-of-fact consideration that extended to good feed and clean water, and the occasional firm word that the horse appeared to find entirely reasonable. She learned it from the way he moved around her in the small space of the cabin, always aware of where she was without making a production of the awareness adjusting his path so as not to crowd her at the dry sink or the hearth. She learned it from the fact that he never once in those first days looked at her the way Edmund Pryor had looked at her on the platform. He did not look at her that way. When he looked at her, which he did less often than she might have expected, and more carefully than she initially noticed, it was with the same unhurried attention he brought to all things, a look that evaluated without diminishing. She found the firewood on the 4th morning, She came down from the loft before dawn, as was her habit, and found that the wood box beside the hearth which she had depleted the previous evening had been refilled. Not simply refilled, but filled, past capacity, stacked with a care that went somewhat beyond the merely functional. The larger pieces at the bottom, the smaller pieces accessible at the top, enough wood to run the hearth for 3 full days without needing to step outside. She stood looking at it for a moment in the gray pre-dawn, with the particular feeling of encountering an act of consideration that has not been announced. She said nothing about it. Neither did he. She found the porch step on the 6th day, the one leading up to the door, which had always had a slight wobble to it, the kind of thing you compensate for automatically after the first encounter. She was coming in from the pump, and her foot hit the step and found it solid and immovable, nailed down with a precision that suggested it had been given more attention than a casual fix required. She stepped on it twice, testing, and then went inside and made supper and said nothing. He said nothing either. On the 8th day she found the flower. It was a small, tough-stemmed desert bloom, yellow-orange, the kind that pushed up through the rocky soil of the ridge with an insistence that Clara had already come to privately admire. It was sitting on the kitchen table beside her coffee cup, placed with a deliberateness that made it clearly not accidental. She stood over it for a long moment in the morning light. Then she put it in the only thing she had that would serve as a vase, which was an empty tin cup, which she set on the windowsill where the morning light came in. It was still there 3 days later when it had gone dry and beginning to fade, and she had not moved it. The relationship between them developed in the way of things that grow in difficult conditions slowly through the root system rather than the visible structure putting down depth before height, resilient precisely because it had not been forced. They did not have long conversations. What they had was a quality of attention to each other's presence that was, in its own way, more intimate than conversation. The kind of attention that develops between people who have chosen each for their own reasons to stop performing for the world and simply exist. She learned that he had built the cabin himself 12 years ago. She learned this because she asked about a mark on the hearthstone, a single initial carved into the corner of the flat stone that formed the base of the fireplace, and he told her briefly that he had put it there the day he finished laying the hearth as a record. She asked why just the initial and not a date, and he was quiet for a moment and then said that the date had not seemed like something worth remembering. She did not press further. He learned that she could read not merely competently, but well, because one evening he came in and found her sitting at the table in the lamplight with a book she had retrieved from her suitcase, reading with the focused pleasure of someone who has not had much time to read recently and is making up for it, and he stood for a moment observing this before he sat down in the chair by the fire. "What is it?" he asked. She looked up. "Middlemarch," she said. "George Eliot." He nodded as though considering this. "Is it any good?" "It is very good," she said. "Would you like me to read aloud?" He was quiet for a moment. "If you want," he said, which she understood meant yes. She read for an hour that evening, and he sat with his elbows on his knees and his eyes on the fire, and she could not tell without looking up from the page whether he was listening. But when she stopped at the end of a chapter and closed the book, he said, "She's harder on herself than anyone else is on her." And she understood that he had been listening very carefully. "Most people are," Clara said. He looked at her, then briefly directly, and then looked back at the fire. She did not analyze the feeling that passed through her chest in that moment. She had become wary of analyzing feelings in the territory of Silas Kane, because analysis led to naming, and naming led to acknowledgement. And acknowledgement was a door she was not yet certain she had the right to open. She kept her heart behind glass, the way you keep something you cannot afford to damage. She looked at it clearly. She did not touch it. What she told herself in the most honest corner of her mind was this: he needed a cook and someone to keep the dust out. That was what he had said on the platform. A job. Nothing more. She was performing a job. She was performing it well. Whatever she felt looking at the line of his shoulders in the firelight, or hearing him say with that particular stiff difficulty that the food was good, or finding that the woodbox was full in the morning, whatever she felt in those moments was her own matter to manage and had nothing to do with the terms of their arrangement. She told herself this with the conviction of a woman who has survived by being honest with herself, even when the honesty was inconvenient. She was not entirely sure she believed it. There was an afternoon in the third week when a storm came down off the mountains with the particular suddenness of territory weather sky, going from clear to dark in the time it took her to get the washing in from the line. Silas came in from the east pasture at a run just ahead of the rain, and they were both inside when the storm broke properly. Rain driving against the single window in solid sheets, and lightning striking close enough that the thunder was less a sound than a physical pressure. The cabin held. The fire held. She made coffee because there was nothing else useful to do in weather that violent, and they sat at the table, not quite across from each other, not quite beside each other, listening to the storm dismantle the afternoon outside. "Does it often come in this fast?" she asked. "In summer?" he said. "You get used to it." "I come from Pennsylvania," she said. "We have storms, but they announce themselves more." "Everything in Pennsylvania does," he said, and she looked at him sharply because it had almost been a joke, and she found that the corners of his mouth had done something very slight that was not quite a smile, but was in the same family. She looked back at her coffee cup to hide whatever her own face was doing. "Have you been?" she asked. "No," he said. "I have not been east of Kansas City." "What is there in Kansas City?" A pause. "A reason to keep going," he said, and offered nothing more, and she did not ask because she recognized the kind of answer that is complete, even when it explains nothing. The rain went on for 2 hours and then stopped as suddenly as it had begun. Leaving the air outside washed clean and the light coming through the window with a clarity it rarely had in the afternoon, and the sound of water dripping from the eaves in the silence that followed the storm was so regular and peaceful that Clara felt sitting at that table in that small firelit space something she had almost forgotten the shape of. She felt briefly and precisely at home. She did not permit herself to hold the feeling. She was too experienced in the arithmetic of loss to hold a feeling like that without first checking the foundations. She was in a man's house, under terms of employment. She was in a town that had already shown its opinion of her clearly. She was 27 years old with 32 cents to her name and no visible path forward. And the fact that she had managed to create in 3 weeks something that felt like a life within these circumstances was not a guarantee that the circumstances would hold. But the feeling while it lasted was real. And when she lay in the loft that night, listening to the last of the rain dripping from the eaves and thinking about the very slight movement at the corner of Silas Kane's mouth that had almost been a smile, she allowed herself one moment of absolute honesty in the dark. She thought with the careful precision of a woman who measures her hope in small units. Because small units are what she can afford to lose, that she was in very serious danger of caring about what happened to this man. She closed her eyes and made herself breathe evenly, and the rain dripped from the eaves in its steady rhythm, and somewhere down on the ridge the coyotes began their nightly conversation, and the territory was dark and vast and indifferent around the small lit cabin, and Clara Voss lay still in the loft and held herself together with both hands and told herself quietly and firmly that caring was a luxury she could not yet afford. She did not entirely listen. The days had a way of adding up on the ridge without announcing themselves. Clara had not been counting exactly, but somewhere in the 5th week she looked up from the kitchen garden. She had begun scratching out behind the cabin a modest ambition of herbs and what she hoped might become a row of beans if the soil cooperated, and realized that the territory had stopped feeling foreign. The smell of juniper in the morning air was simply the smell of morning. The sound of Silas's axe in the pre-dawn dark was simply the sound that meant the day had started. The particular quality of light on the red rock of the ridge in the late afternoon, that deep amber warmth that made everything it touched look like it had been burnished by hand, was simply what late afternoon looked like. She was not sure when this had happened. She was not sure how she felt about the fact that it had. The garden was Silas's idea, which surprised her. He had come around the back of the cabin one evening to check on a section of roof she had mentioned was dripping, and he had stood for a moment looking at the ground she had been clearing, the rocks she had moved to the side, the soil she had been working with a stick because she did not yet have a proper tool for it. "What are you putting in?" he asked. "Herbs, if the ground will take it. Beans, if I can find seed." She sat back on her heels and looked at the cleared patch critically. "It is not much, but fresh herbs make a difference to a meal." He was quiet for a moment. Then he went to the lean-to beside the cabin and came back with a short-handled spade that he set on the ground beside her without comment. The next morning she found a paper packet of bean seed on the kitchen table beside her coffee cup in the same spot where the desert flower had been. She planted the beans that afternoon. She did not thank him directly because she had come to understand that direct gratitude made him uncomfortable in the way that most explicit acknowledgments did, as though being seen doing something kind was somehow more exposing than the act itself. Instead, she made his coffee the way she had learned he preferred it, which was strong enough to alarm most people, and set it on the table without comment. And he drank it and said nothing, and they were in this way even. It was around this time that the mending began. She had noticed his coats from the first week, the heavy canvas work coat with the torn left pocket, the wool coat he wore in the evenings with the fraying cuffs, the leather vest with the cracked stitching along the right side seam. She had noticed them the way she noticed everything in the cabin that needed attention as items on an internal list. But she had held off on the mending specifically because the coats were personal in a way that the porch board was not, and she had been uncertain whether reaching that far into his daily life was within the terms of what they had agreed. What decided her was watching him catch the torn pocket on the door latch for the third time in a week and make the small, controlled movement of a man suppressing irritation. She waited until he was out on the east pasture, and then she took the canvas coat down from its peg and spread it on the table and went through her sewing case with the focused attention of someone planning a repair rather than a gesture. She had good thread and 2 needles and a small pair of scissors, and the patience for fine work that she had developed over a lifetime of making things last longer than they were designed to last. She remade the pocket entirely, cutting away the torn section and working a new base from a piece of heavy cotton she had in her case for exactly such contingencies, and then she went over the coat's other seams with the systematic honesty of a person who believes that if a thing is worth doing, it is worth doing completely. She had the coat back on its peg before he returned. He put it on the next morning without comment. But she watched him check the pocket before he went out, pressing it with 2 fingers in the way you test something you expect to find broken and finding it solid, and she saw the brief stillness that passed over his face before he turned for the door. She did the wool coat the following week and the vest the week after that, working through each item with the same thoroughness, and he never mentioned it directly. Not once, but each time she rehung a mended garment, she would find within a day or two some small reciprocal act of consideration. A new shelf bracket replacing the one that had been working loose. A second lamp acquired from somewhere and placed on the loft railing so she could read in the evenings without coming down a piece of oilcloth tacked over the window frame to seal the draft that had been coming in from the north. They were building something. Neither of them said so. Neither of them had the vocabulary for it yet, or perhaps the courage, and so it was built the way most enduring things are built, quietly through the accumulation of small and careful acts, each one saying what the builder could not yet bring themselves to say aloud. The evenings with the book continued. She read to him 3 or 4 times a week now. Not by arrangement, but by a kind of mutual unspoken agreement, she would pick up the book, and he would settle in the chair by the fire. And that was the whole negotiation. They had finished Middlemarch, and moved on to a volume of short stories she had also brought, and then to a history of the Western Territories that she had found, to her genuine surprise, on a shelf in the lean-to under a piece of canvas, its spine intact, and its pages water-stained but readable. "This is yours," she said, bringing it in one evening. He looked at it from across the room. "I forgot I had that," he said. "It is a good history," she said. "Shall I read it, or would you rather a pause that had something complicated in it?" "You read it," he said. She did not ask whether he had trouble with reading. It was not her business to ask, and in any case it did not matter to her in the way it might matter to someone who evaluated people by their education. What she thought privately was that a man who listened to George Eliot with that quality of attention and came away with observations that precise was not a man who lacked intelligence. He lacked only what many frontier men lacked, which was access. She read the history with the same attention she brought to the fiction, and he listened with the same focused stillness, and sometimes he would stop her with a question or a correction from his own experience of the land she was reading about, because he had ridden through many of the places the history described, and his knowledge of them was particular and physical in a way the book's was not. "That pass," he said one evening when she was reading a section about a mountain crossing to the north. "The book says the elevation is manageable in October. It is not. I have been through it in October. There is snow on the north face by the second week." "How old were you?" she asked. 19, he said. "Where were you going?" The fire shifted and settled. He looked at it for a moment. "Away," he said simply. She nodded and found her place in the book and continued reading. It was on a Tuesday in the 6th week that Clara first went back into Red Hollow Creek. She had been putting it off with a practical justification that there was enough lamp oil left, enough salt, enough of the essential supplies that a trip could be delayed. But she was aware that this was a justification rather than a reason, and that the real reason was simpler and less dignified. She did not want to go back into that town. She did not want to stand in a store where she had been publicly humiliated and conduct the ordinary business of a person with the right to be there. But the lamp oil was genuinely low, and the salt was down to the last of the box, and she needed thread for a repair she had been putting off, and there was no more honest way to frame it. She needed to go to town, she told Silas at breakfast. He was quiet for a moment in the way that had come to mean he was thinking about something he was not yet certain he wanted to say. "I can get what you need," he said. "I know," she said, "but I should go myself." He looked at her directly then, and there was something in the look that she could not fully read, something between concern and a reluctant respect for the decision she had made. He did not argue. He told her to take the wagon and gave her a brief list of his own nails of a specific size and a new whetstone to replace the one he had cracked, and he said, without quite looking at her, "If there is trouble, you don't owe anyone a response." "I know that too," she said. She took the wagon down the ridge in the cool of the morning with her spine straight and her hands steady on the reins and the list in her coat pocket, and the 32 cents she had arrived with still in her purse, supplemented now by the 3 weeks of wages Silas had paid, with the consistent, almost formal regularity of a man who understands that money owed is a debt that diminishes the debtor, not the creditor. Red Hollow Creek in the morning had a slightly different character than it had in the afternoon heat of her arrival. The main street was busy with the functional commerce of a working town wagons being loaded, the smithy already ringing a group of men gathered outside the saloon with the comfortable leisure of those who have finished their morning work early. She drove the wagon to the far end of the street and tied the roan at the post outside the general store and went in. The store was owned by a man named Garrett, who was perhaps 50, with the watchful assessing eyes of a man who had been measuring people by their ability to pay for long enough that the habit had become his default mode of observation. He looked at Clara when she came in. She had seen that look before, the flicker of recognition, the rapid social calculation. "Help you," he said in the tone of a man who has not yet decided whether he will. "I have a list," she said, and placed it on the counter. He looked at the list. He looked at her. He looked at the list again. Then, with the mechanical efficiency of a man whose commercial instincts had won the brief argument with his social ones, he began pulling items from the shelves. She was nearly done, was standing at the counter calculating her total with the focused arithmetic of a woman who has always had to count carefully, when the door opened behind her and she heard the voice of a woman she did not know say to a companion who was apparently just outside, "That is the one, living up on the ridge with him." Clara did not turn. She kept her eyes on the counter and continued adding figures. "Bold as anything," the voice continued, dropping to the register people use when they intend to be overheard, "after what he did, and her no better than she should be if she is willing to stay under that roof." The companion said something Clara could not make out. The first woman's response was perfectly audible. "He killed 4 men in that mine, 4 men with families, and she is up there cooking his meals like it is all perfectly ordinary." Clara placed her money on the counter with a steadiness she was genuinely proud of. Garrett gave her change without meeting her eyes. She picked up her parcel and turned and walked past the 2 women at the door, who parted for her with the particular theatrical reluctance of people who want their disapproval to be physically felt, and she went out into the street and untied the roan and climbed up to the wagon bench and sat. She sat for a moment before she picked up the reins. He killed 4 men in that mine. She had heard the stories in fragments since her arrival, pieces of the town's mythology about the man on the ridge, offered in the lowered voices people use for things they have told so many times they have stopped questioning. She had not asked Silas about any of it. It had not seemed like her right, and in any case, she had developed her own understanding of him over 6 weeks of close proximity. The understanding that comes from watching a person work and eat and sit quietly and tend to their animals and leave flowers on a table, an understanding that did not require the town's narration. But 4 men in a mine. She sat with the weight of it on the wagon bench in the morning sun and tried to reconcile it with everything she had observed, and found that she could not do it, simply that the reconciliation, if it existed, was going to be complicated. And that complicated was not the same as impossible. She picked up the reins and turned the wagon for the ridge. She said nothing to Silas when she returned. She put away the supplies with her usual methodical efficiency and started on the midday meal and said nothing, and he did not ask, and she did not know whether his not asking was sensitivity or simply his habitual economy with questions. Either way, she was grateful for it. But that evening after supper, when he was sitting by the fire, and she had not yet picked up the book, she said into the comfortable silence, "The town thinks you killed 4 men. The fire shifted. He did not move. "The town is not entirely wrong," he said. She looked at him. He was still looking at the fire, and his face had gone to that closed, still expression she had come to understand as the face he wore when something was costing him more than he intended to show. "Tell me," she said, not a demand, not a question exactly, something quieter than both. A long pause, long enough that she thought he would not. Then he said, "I was the shift foreman, East Tunnel Callaway Mine 7 years ago. I got a report the supports were failing, from 2 of my men directly. I took it to the mine owner, and he told me the report was wrong, that the men were scared, and the supports were fine, and I had a choice to make." He stopped. The fire spoke quietly in the silence. "I made the wrong one." "You believed him," she said. "I wanted to believe him," he said, and the distinction was precise and apparently important to him. "There is a difference." "And the tunnel collapsed," she said. 3 days later, 4 men on that shift. 2 of them were the men who brought me the report." He said this last part with a flatness that was not indifference, but the opposite, the flatness of a feeling so large and so long held that it had worn itself into something almost featureless. "I went to the law, testified against Calloway. He had more lawyers than the county had seen in a decade, and he walked out of it a free man, and I walked out of it a pariah, which is the correct outcome," he added, without bitterness, simply as a statement of accounting. "I was responsible. I have not stopped being responsible." Clara was quiet for a long moment. The fire settled, and Silas looked at it, and she looked at him, and she thought about all the things she could say, and selected the truest one. "You have been punishing yourself for 7 years, she said. "It is not punishment," he said. "It is consequence." "And the difference?" He looked at her then fully directly, and there was in his face something she had not seen before, something raw, beneath the usual hardness, the look of a man who has had a question put to him that he has been asking himself for a very long time without being able to answer. "I don't know," he said. She nodded slowly. She picked up the book. She found her page. She read to him for an hour without either of them referring to what had been said, and he sat in his chair with his elbows on his knees and the firelight moving on his face. And somewhere in the second chapter, she looked up briefly and found him watching her rather than the fire. And he did not look away immediately, and she did not look away immediately, and the moment stretched between them in the warm air of the cabin, like something neither of them had planned to reach for, and neither of them quite knew how to set back down. She looked back at the page. She read the words but did not entirely hear them, because the larger part of her attention had moved to the feeling she had been keeping behind glass, and she was aware, with a clarity that was almost physical, that the glass had developed a crack. He killed 4 men, the town said. He made a wrong decision and lived with it for 7 years with no mitigation and no excuse, and no apparent desire to claim any. And the consequence of that honesty was that he had been exiled from every ordinary human warmth that most people take as their due. And he had accepted the exile as correct, and he had been alone on this ridge with his horses and his work and his guilt for longer than she had been in the territory. She thought about the wood box filled in the dark before dawn. She thought about the bean seed on the table. She thought about the history book under the canvas in the lean-to. She thought about 7 years of a man carrying something too heavy to put down and too familiar to imagine living without. She could feel with the particular acuity of someone who has spent a lifetime being careful about what they feel exactly how dangerous this territory was. She was in a man's house under terms of employment. She had no claim on his history or his present or his future. She had no claim on anything at all except her own 2 hands and the work they could do. She told herself this with great firmness. And then Silas said very quietly, not quite to her and not quite to himself, "The cabin is different now, since you came." She kept her eyes on the book. "Different how?" she asked, and her voice was steady. She was proud of how steady it was. "Warmer," he said. And then, after a pause that contained considerable weight, "Not the fire." She turned a page she had not finished reading. Outside, the coyotes were beginning their conversation in the dark, and the fire was burning low, and the territory night pressed against the windows of the small lit cabin, and Clara Voss sat at the table, with a book open in her hands, and the full, frightening knowledge that she was not behind glass anymore, that she had not been for some time, and that the crack had not been in the glass at all. It had been in the wall she had built around the glass. She breathed. She found her place on the page. She kept reading. She did not tell him what she felt. She was not ready. She was not certain she would survive being wrong about this particular thing, and she had survived too much through too long to risk what she could not afford to lose. But she read to him until the fire was coals and the hour was late. And when she finally climbed the ladder to the loft, she lay on the pallet and stared at the ceiling and understood with the helpless precision of a woman who has always been honest with herself, even when the honesty was a wound that she had already lost the argument. She was in love with Silas Kane. She had probably been in love with him for some time, and she had absolutely no idea what to do about it, except to keep making his coffee and mending his coats and reading to him in the evenings, and to guard what she felt with everything she had, because caring for someone who did not know they were cared for was a private matter, and private matters were the only kind she had ever truly known how to keep. She did not speak of what she had understood that night. She put it away in the deepest interior room of herself, the room she had been building and furnishing since childhood, the room where she kept the things that were true but not yet safe to say aloud, and she locked the door and went on with her days. This was not as difficult as it might sound. Clara had spent most of her life loving people who did not know they were being loved, or knowing it, and finding it inconvenient, and she had developed in response a particular competency for carrying feeling without displaying it the way certain desert plants carry water through months of drought, invisibly efficiently losing nothing to evaporation. She cooked his meals and mended what needed mending and read to him in the evenings, and managed the small domestic world of the ridge cabin with the same quiet thoroughness she had brought to every task since her arrival. And if there was something different now in the quality of her attention when he spoke or in the particular care she took with his coffee in the mornings, he gave no indication that he noticed. Or perhaps he noticed and said nothing. With Silas, the two possibilities were not always distinguishable from the outside. What she did not do was examine the question of whether he felt anything in return. She could not afford that examination. To examine it honestly would require her to account for the woodbox and the bean seed and the flower and the lamp on the loft railing and the evening's reading and the way his voice had sounded when he said the word warmer, not the fire. And to account for all of those things honestly was to arrive at a conclusion she was not ready to act on, because acting on it meant risking the only stable ground she had found in 27 years of looking for it. So she did not examine it. She kept the door locked and went on with her days. It was the 7th week when she needed to go back into town. The garden was doing better than she had dared hope. The beans had come up in 2 clean rows, and the herbs were establishing themselves with the tenacity of things that have decided to survive, regardless of what the soil thinks about it. But she needed more seed if she was going to extend the garden before the season turned. And she needed a length of cotton cloth she had been putting off buying, and the lamp oil was low again. There was no practical justification for delay. She went on a Wednesday morning early when the town was at its most functional and least interested in the small dramas of its social landscape. She wore her better dress, the deep blue that had faded at the shoulders, and she pinned her hair with the same precision she always brought to it. Not because she cared what Red Hollow Creek thought of her appearance, but because she cared what she thought of her own, and she drove the wagon down the ridge with her spine straight, and her hands steady, and her mind already composing the list of what she needed. The general store was quiet when she arrived. Garrett was behind the counter, and he served her without the theatrical hesitation of her previous visit, which she took as a small but real measure of progress. She worked through her list methodically, and she was at the back of the store examining bolts of cotton cloth when the 2 women came in. She heard them before she saw them. The voice she recognized was the one that had carried so clearly through the general store on her previous visit, a certain Mrs. Aldridge. She had subsequently learned the wife of the man who owned the largest ranch south of town, and therefore a person of considerable social authority in Red Hollow Creek. The other voice was younger, less certain, performing its cruelty in a key slightly below Mrs. Aldridge's confident register. "She is here," the younger voice said, not as quietly as it apparently intended. Clara continued examining the cloth. "Of course she is, Mrs." Aldridge said, and her voice had the particular carrying quality of a woman who has never had reason to lower it. "She will keep coming until she has bought out the store, or until Silas Kane tires of her, whichever comes first. Though I imagine with a woman of her sort, he will tire of her first." Clara's hands did not stop moving over the cloth. "What do you mean, her sort?" the younger woman asked. "Women who make themselves useful," Mrs. Aldridge said, with a precision that was more surgical than accidental, "to men who have no other options. She is not the first woman to find her way onto a lonely man's property under the guise of employment. She will not be the last." A pause that was clearly theatrical. "Though I grant you she is a particular type, plain women often are more determined about it." The cloth under Clara's hands was a deep green, cotton sturdy, and even woven exactly what she needed. She measured it by eye against her arm, calculating the length she required, and did not look up. "My husband says," the younger woman offered, "that the town ought to do something about Silas Kane. That it is not right a man like that, with what he did living free up on that ridge." "Your husband is right," Mrs. Aldridge said. "4 men dead, and he walked away with nothing but that scar, if there were any justice in this territory." She paused. "And now he has imported a woman to keep him comfortable, while decent families cannot walk into the general store without being confronted with the sight of his arrangements." Clara put the cloth down. She turned around. Both women looked at her. Mrs. Aldridge had the particular expression of someone caught doing something they were not prepared to entirely regret. The younger woman looked away immediately. "I wonder," Clara said, and her voice was entirely steady. She would think about this later with something approaching wonder. Entirely steady. "Whether either of you has ever lost someone in that mine." Mrs. Aldridge opened her mouth. "Because the men who did lose someone," Clara continued, "seemed to agree, based on the testimony given in the legal proceedings, that the fault lay with the mine owner who falsified the safety reports and overruled the foreman's concerns. That is in the public record, if either of you is interested in the public record, which I understand is not always the more satisfying version of a story." The store was very quiet. "Silas Kane has lived for 7 years with the weight of a decision he made in good faith on bad information," Clara said. "He has not excused it. He has not run from it. He has carried it with more integrity than most people carry their far smaller failures. And what this town has done in return is make him a legend to frighten children, with which is easier than understanding a complicated thing and considerably less Christian." She picked up the cloth and carried it to the counter. "I will take 3 yards of this," she told Garrett, who was standing behind the counter with the expression of a man who has witnessed something he will be describing to his wife for approximately the next 6 years. She heard the door of the store open and close behind her. She did not look to see which woman had left and which had stayed. She paid for her goods and carried them to the wagon and stowed them in the bed with the careful efficiency she brought to everything, and she untied the roan and climbed to the bench and sat. Her hands, she noticed, were shaking slightly. Not from fear, from the sustained effort of holding herself so precisely still for so long, while something inside her moved at considerable velocity. She held the reins without yet telling the horse to go, and breathed with the deliberate, measured technique she had developed over a lifetime of public composure, and she waited until the shaking stopped. Then she looked up and saw Silas. He was standing on the far side of the street, in the narrow gap between the smithy and the feed store, and he was absolutely still. He had been there for some time, she understood with a sudden, cold clarity. Long enough. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, and the unfamiliarity of it was what held her, because she had spent 7 weeks learning his expressions the way you learn the terrain of a place you intend to stay in, and this one did not fit any of her categories. It was not anger. It was not pity. It was something that lived closer to pain than either a raw and internal thing that he was making no effort to conceal, which was itself extraordinary, because concealment was among his most practiced skills. He stood in the gap between the buildings and looked at her, and she looked back at him, and neither of them moved for a long moment. Then he turned and walked away before she could speak. She drove back to the ridge alone. He did not come in for supper that evening until long after dark, and when he came in, she had kept the stew warm on the low fire, and she set it on the table without comment, and he sat and ate, and she sat across from him, and they were both quiet in a way that was different from their usual quiet. The usual quiet was a comfortable thing, a shared medium they moved through without friction. This quiet had edges. He put down his spoon when the bowl was half finished. "How long were you in the store?" he said. Not quite a question. "Long enough," she said. He was quiet again. She watched him turn something over in his mind, could almost see the motion of it in the set of his shoulders. "You did not have to say what you said," he said. "No," she agreed. "I wanted to." He looked at her. "Why?" The question sat between them on the table, simple and direct, and considerably more loaded than its single syllable suggested. She considered her answer with the care it deserved. "Because it was true," she said finally, "and someone ought to have said it some time ago." He held her gaze for a long moment and then looked down at his bowl, and when he spoke again, his voice was lower, rougher, as though the words were coming from somewhere that did not get much air. "You should not have to defend me," he said. "In that store or anywhere. You should not have to carry that along with everything else." "I was not carrying it for you," she said gently. "I was carrying it because it was the right thing to carry." He was quiet. The fire spoke. Outside, the coyotes had begun. She cleared the table and washed up and climbed to the loft, and she lay on the pallet in the dark and stared at the ceiling and felt the weight of what had shifted between them. The thing that had moved in the store and then again in the street. The way a rock slides when the ground beneath it changes, inevitable and irreversible once begun. She did not know what it meant. She knew only that it had happened, and that the room in herself where she had been keeping what she felt was no longer quite sufficient to contain it. She was still awake an hour later when she heard him below. He was not moving toward the fire or the door. He had stopped at the base of the ladder. She heard the silence of a man standing still and deciding something, and then she heard his voice, quiet and without inflection, as though he were reporting a fact rather than making a confession. "I have been watching you for 7 weeks," he said to the dark space at the base of the ladder, to the ceiling above him, to whatever courage he had managed to gather. "I told myself it was not what it was, that you were here under a practical arrangement, and I was a practical man, and it was nothing more than that." A pause. "I am not a practical man." Clara lay absolutely still on the pallet. "I know I have no right to say this," he said. "I know what I am and what I am not, and what this town will always think of both of us if you stay here. I know it is not a fair situation to ask anyone to walk into." Another pause longer. "But I find that I cannot watch you go into that town and stand in that store and defend me to people who have made up their minds and then come home and say nothing, because saying nothing is the coward's position. And I have been in the coward's position for 7 years, and I am finished with it." The fire below had burned low, and the loft was very dark, and Clara lay still and breathed. "I am saying," he said, and now his voice was barely above a murmur, rough with the effort of being said at all, that the cabin is not the only thing that is warmer. "Since you came." The silence afterward was complete. Clara sat up on the pallet. She could see nothing in the darkness of the loft, only the faint orange suggestion of coals in the hearth below. She sat with her hands in her lap, and her heart conducting itself at a rate she found somewhat alarming, and she thought about the room with the locked door and the glass and the crack that had become a wall that had already been breached without her fully deciding to breach it. And she understood that there was a choice to be made here that was not really a choice at all, not because she had no options, but because she already knew what she felt and had always known it, and the only question remaining was whether she was brave enough to say it. She had survived a platform in front of 30 people. She had survived a store full of cruelty. She had survived 27 years of being told she was not enough by the people who were supposed to know her best. She could survive saying a true thing in the dark. "Silas," she said, a pause from below. "Yes." "Come up here," she said. The silence stretched. She could hear him breathing at the base of the ladder, and then the sound of his hand on the first rung, and then his weight on the ladder with the careful heaviness of a large man moving in a confined space. And then he was in the loft, and she could not see his face, but she could feel him, the warmth and mass of him, in the small dark space, the particular quality of attention he always carried. She reached out her hand in the direction of his voice. His hand found hers in the dark. It covered it entirely, the way his hands covered most things, and it held with a carefulness that was not timidity, but the particular gentleness of someone who knows their own strength and has learned to compensate for it. They sat like that in the dark of the loft for a moment that neither of them counted. "I am not easy to know," she said quietly. "I know," he said. "I am not easy to be near." "You are actually," she said. "You are considerably easier than most people I have known." She heard the slight shift of his breath that meant she had surprised him, and she thought that surprising Silas Kane was among the more satisfying things she had encountered in the territory. "Clara," he said. And the way he said her name, just her name with that particular rough and careful quality, was enough. "I know," she said. "I know." He did not kiss her. That was not what the moment was. The moment was his hand holding hers in the dark of the loft above a dying fire, in a cabin and on a ridge in the territory, and her sitting still and letting herself be held without pulling back or qualifying or reminding herself of all the practical reasons why she should, and it was in its way more intimate than anything more dramatic could have been, because it was simply true. Simply the two of them, without performance or pretense in the dark. He climbed back down the ladder eventually because the situation required it, and she lay back on the pallet and stared at the ceiling with her hand still warm from his and listened to the territory dark outside and thought with a clarity she had not felt in a very long time that she was not behind glass any more, and the ground beneath her was holding. She did not know yet what they were building. She knew only that they were building it together, and that together was a word she had almost stopped believing in. She slept better than she had in years. The 3 days that followed were different from what came before, in the way that mornings are different from nights, the same world, the same terrain, the same two people moving through the same small daily rhythms, but lit differently. The quality of light changed enough to change the look of everything it fell on. He still said very little. She still said what was necessary, and no more. But something between them had been named quietly, and in the dark, and the naming had changed the shape of the space they shared in ways that were mostly invisible and entirely real. He began very occasionally to touch her shoulder when he moved past her at the hearth, the briefest contact, less than a second, the back of his hand against her shoulder in passing, and the first time it happened, she went very still and then went on with what she was doing, and the second time she did the same, and they did not discuss it because there was nothing to discuss. It was simply what it was: a man who had been alone for 7 years, learning the small vocabulary of proximity, one word at a time. She began in the evenings to sit in the second chair by the fire rather than at the table, and he began without comment to orient his chair very slightly toward hers rather than directly at the fire. And these adjustments were minor and domestic and meant everything. And then came the morning of the fourth day, which undid everything. She woke to the sound of the wagon. Not Silas's wagon, a different horse's gait, lighter and faster, and she came down from the loft to find him already standing in the open doorway, looking out at the track. A rider she did not recognize was coming up the ridge at a pace that meant urgency. Silas went out to meet him, and Clara stayed in the doorway and watched them speak. Watched the rider pass something down from the saddle. Watched Silas stand, looking at whatever it was, for a long, still moment after the rider had turned back down the track. He came inside with a letter in his hand. He set it on the table. "It is for you," he said. His voice had returned to its first register, the flat, closed register she had not heard in weeks, the voice that went ahead of the expression he wore when he was preparing to carry something heavy. She picked up the letter. The return address was the matrimonial agency in Philadelphia. She read it, standing at the table, and Silas stood at the window and looked out at the ridge, and the cabin around them was very quiet. The agency had found an error in the arrangement. Edmund Pryor had disputed the contract on grounds of misrepresentation, and in the dispute it had emerged that the agency had made a significant administrative error. They had failed to include the passage money in the contract, which meant that the money Pryor had spent on her fare was legally recoverable, which meant the agency owed him a refund, which meant, the letter explained with the apologetic efficiency of an institution, managing a liability that they were prepared to offer Clara Voss a corrected placement. A fully funded passage to a new situation, a widower in Vermont named Aldous Carr, who was looking for exactly what she offered, capability and good sense and a practical disposition, and who had a proper house and a respectable income and the full approval of his community. Vermont, a proper house, a respectable income, the full approval of a community that did not know her name and had not made up its mind about her. She set the letter on the table and looked at it. She heard Silas move away from the window. She heard him cross the room. She heard the particular sound of him at the shelf, the unhurried movement of a man who has decided on a course of action and is now executing it with the methodical deliberateness he brought to everything. She looked up. He had her suitcase in his hand. Her heart did something she could not account for physically, a sudden violent contraction that had nothing to do with its normal function. He set the suitcase on the table beside the letter. He went back to the shelf, and she heard the sound of paper, and when he turned around, he had an envelope in his hand, thick with what she recognized even from across the room as folded bills. He set it beside the suitcase. He set a train ticket on top of the envelope, a first-class ticket. She saw the kind she had never in her life held in her hand. And then he put on his face. She had not seen it since the platform. The closed, hard, impenetrable face. The face that had frightened a crowd into silence. The face that was not Silas, but was the armor Silas wore when Silas could not be permitted to show. He put it on with the precision of a man who has worn it for so long that the muscles remember the shape, and he looked at her across the table, and his voice when he spoke was entirely without inflection. "You have served your purpose here," he said. "The place is in order. I can manage from here." Clara looked at him. "I am tired, and," he said, and the word came out with a flatness so studied she could hear the study in it of having you underfoot. "Take the money and the ticket and go to Vermont. It is a better situation than this." She looked at him for a long time. She looked at his face, the closed and armored face, and she looked at his hands, which were at his sides and entirely still. And she looked at his eyes, which were the place the armor was weakest, and in his eyes she saw what she needed to see. She saw the cost of what he was doing. She saw the precise, excruciating effort it was taking him to stand in front of her and say these things, and she understood with a comprehension that went below thought into the body itself exactly what he was doing and why. He was sacrificing himself. He was looking at Vermont and a proper house and the full approval of a community and a respectable man, and setting it in front of her like the only gift he believed himself capable of giving. And he was using the most brutal tool he had to make sure she took it, because he knew her well enough by now to know that she would not take it if he simply asked her to. He was protecting her the only way he knew, by becoming the thing she ought to leave. She felt the love for him move through her chest like something enormous shifting in deep water, immense and slow and irresistible. And she felt the grief of it right alongside, because she could not save him from this. She could see what he was doing, and she could see why he was doing it, and she could not save him from it, because he had made the decision in the part of himself where he kept the things that were true but not yet safe to say. The same room she kept her own truths in, and a decision made in that room is not easily unlocked from the outside. She looked at him for one more moment. Then she crossed to the fireplace. His winter coat hung on the peg beside the hearth, the wool coat she had mended with careful hands. In the 5th week the cuff she had turned and restitched the lining she had repaired with a scrap of cotton from her case. She took it down from the peg. She crossed to the chair by the fire, and she laid it over the arm of his chair with a deliberateness that was not hurried. That was in fact the most careful thing she had done in weeks, laying it down the way you lay something down when you want the person who finds it to know it was laid with intention. She picked up her suitcase. She picked up the envelope and the ticket. She walked to the door. She stopped with her hand on the frame, and she did not turn around, because if she turned around and looked at his face, she would not be able to walk through the door. And she needed to walk through the door, not because she was leaving, but because he needed to believe she was, and she needed to give him the time and the space and the silence to understand what he was actually doing. She stepped off the porch. She walked down the track toward Gaytown with her suitcase in her hand, and the morning sun on her shoulders, and her heart in several pieces, every one of them pointing back up the ridge. The track down the ridge had never seemed so long. Clara walked it with her suitcase and the morning sun building at her back, and the juniper and pinon pressed close on either side, and the red rock of the ridge rose above her, and every step she took away from the cabin was a step she took with the full knowledge of what she was leaving behind and why. And the knowledge did not make the steps easier. It made them the hardest thing she had done since she stepped off a train onto a platform in front of 30 strangers and remained standing. She did not cry. She had learned very early that crying was a luxury that required privacy, and she was not yet private enough, not yet far enough from the cabin to be certain that the sound would not carry, and she had her pride, which was not vanity, but the structural thing, the load-bearing element that had kept her upright through everything that had tried to put her down. She carried her suitcase, and she walked, and she breathed, and the territory around her was indifferent and vast and beautiful in the way of things that have no opinion of human suffering, and the morning went on regardless. She thought about the coat on the chair. She had placed it there because she wanted him to find it and understand what it meant, which was everything she could not say, standing in the doorway of the cabin without breaking both of them entirely. The coat was the 7 weeks of her hands on his things, her care worked into every stitch, the tangible record of what she had given freely and without account. She had left it not as a goodbye, but as a statement, as the clearest thing she knew how to say without words. I was here. I chose to be here. What I did here I did because it mattered to me. Whether he would read it that way, whether he was capable in this moment of reading anything other than the story he had already decided to tell himself, which was the story of a woman better served by Vermont, and a respectable man, and the full approval of a community she did not know. She could not know. What she knew was that she had said what she could say, and done what she could do, and the rest was his to decide, because a person's healing is their own work, and you cannot do it for them. No matter how much you love them, you can only refuse to pretend The wound is not there. The town appeared below her as she came around the last bend of the track, small and flat in the morning light, its false front buildings casting abbreviated shadows in the early sun. She looked at it without the dread she had carried on her previous visits, because the dread had been replaced by something larger and more consuming that left no room for smaller feelings. She walked into Red Hollow Creek, carrying her suitcase and her broken heart, with the same upright bearing she had carried everything else. And if the people she passed on the main street looked at her with their customary curiosity, she did not notice because she was not looking at them. She was going to the station. She had the ticket in her purse and the envelope of bills and a train east in 3 hours and a future in Vermont that was by any reasonable measure a better situation than the one she was walking away from. She knew this. She had always known how to assess a situation with clear eyes and correct for sentiment, and the correct assessment of this situation was that Silas Kane had offered her the most generous thing he knew how to offer, which was the door to a life he believed he could not give her, and the reasonable response was to walk through it. She was not certain she was a reasonable woman. She bought a cup of coffee at the small eating establishment beside the depot and sat at the counter and drank it slowly and thought about reasonable. She thought about the train to Vermont and Aldous Carr Widower Proper House, respectable income, full community approval, and she tried to build a picture of it in her mind the way she had once built a picture of Red Hollow Creek, and the fresh start it represented, and the picture would not hold. It kept dissolving at the edges and being replaced by a cabin on a ridge and a fire in a stone hearth and a man sitting with his elbows on his knees, watching the flames and saying things with a stiffness that made them more true rather than less. She set down her coffee cup. She thought about the coat on the chair. She thought about the face he had put on the mask she had seen assembled in front of her, like a man closing the shutters of a house before a storm. And she thought about his eyes, which had not been able to hold the mask all the way through. She thought about what it cost him to stand in that cabin and say those words to her. The deliberate cruelty of it, the precision with which he had selected exactly the words most likely to make her go to protect her by wounding her to sacrifice what he wanted in order to give her what he had decided she deserved. She thought about 7 years of a man deciding what he deserved and administering the sentence himself without appeal. She thought about what she had said in the general store to Mrs. Aldridge, with the whole store listening, that Silas Kane had carried his failure with more integrity than most people carry their far smaller ones, that he had not run from it, that he had not excused it. She had believed every word when she said it, and she believed it still. And she asked herself now, sitting at the counter of a small eating establishment in Red Hollow Creek, with a train ticket to Vermont in her purse, whether she was prepared to let him run from this. Because that was what it was. He had called himself a practical man, and it had not been true, and he knew it was not true. And what he was doing with the suitcase and the money and the first-class ticket was choosing exile again, because exile was the only consequence he knew how to apply to himself, and she was the collateral of it. She put down the money for the coffee and stood up. She picked up her suitcase and she walked out of the eating establishment and she stood on the street in front of the depot, and she looked at the door of the station and she thought very clearly in the plainest language she could find that she had not come this far and survived this much to get on a train to Vermont because Silas Kane had decided she should. She set her suitcase down. She sat on it. She was going to wait. She did not know how long she was going to wait. She did not know if what she was waiting for was coming. But she was going to sit on her suitcase in front of the Red Hollow Creek depot, and she was going to wait because the alternative was a train east and a future she had not chosen, and Clara Voss had spent enough of her life accommodating futures other people had chosen for her. She was finished with that. She had been finished with it since the platform. The morning wore on. The town conducted its business around her with the incurious efficiency of a place that had more pressing things to attend to than a woman sitting on a suitcase outside the depot. Or perhaps it was simply that Clara Voss, sitting somewhere with her spine straight and her face composed, had stopped being a novelty. The sun climbed, the shadows shortened, the first whistle of the approaching train reached her from somewhere north of town, faint and clean in the dry air, and she heard it, and she did not move. She was looking at her hands in her lap when the sound came. Not the train. A horse. Coming fast, coming from the north end of town, coming with the particular urgency of a horse that has been asked for everything it has and is giving it. She looked up. He came around the corner at the north end of the main street on the Rhone, and he was riding with a focused, furious intention that scattered the two men walking in the street in front of him without apparently any awareness on his part that they existed. He had no hat. She had never seen him without his hat, and the absence of it struck her as the most remarkable thing, more remarkable than the speed, more remarkable than the expression on his face, which was the expression of a man who has made a decision in the part of himself where decisions cannot be unmade. He pulled the roan up 20 feet from the depot, and was off the horse before it had fully stopped, and he was walking toward her with the directness of a man who has burned down all his hesitations and has nothing left to navigate around. And the crowd on the street, because it was mid-morning and the street was not empty, turned to watch with the instinctive collective attention of people who recognize that something real is happening. Clara stood up from her suitcase. He stopped in front of her. He was breathing hard from the ride, and the scar along his jaw was pale in the full morning light, and his gray eyes were on her face with an attention so complete it was almost physical. He looked at her for a moment, just looked at her. And then he did something she had not expected. He dumbly took off his hat. She realized he must have picked it up on his way out because he had it in his hand, and he held it at his side, and he stood in the middle of the main street of Red Hollow Creek in front of the depot and the assembled citizens of the town without pulling his collar up or angling his face away from the crowd, and he was fully, completely, undisguisedly himself, scar and history and all of it, making no accommodation for the judgment of anyone watching. "I found the coat," he said. His voice was rough and low, and she could hear in it the effort of the ride, and beneath that the larger effort of what he was doing. "I found the coat on the chair, and I sat with it for 1 hour, and then I understood that I am a fool." She looked at him. "I told myself I was protecting you," he said. "I told myself that was the reason. That keeping you on that ridge was selfish, and sending you away was the right thing, the decent thing, the thing a man does when he cares more about a person's life than his own." He stopped. Around them, the street had gone very quiet, in the way streets go quiet when everyone on them has stopped pretending to do something else. That was partially true and mostly cowardice, and I am finished with both. Clara said nothing. She was listening with her whole self, with everything she had, because she understood that this was costing him more than anything had cost him in 7 years, and she owed it the fullness of her attention. "I have been in exile from my own life since the mine," he said. "I decided that was correct, that it was consequence and not punishment, and I told myself that distinction mattered, but I think now that I was wrong. I think now that there is a point at which a man who refuses all mercy becomes as dishonest as a man who refuses all accountability, because I was refusing the mercy of being known by someone really known and told that I was still worth knowing." His jaw was tight, and he held her gaze with the same unflinching directness he had brought to everything. "You did that. You did that in 7 weeks without asking anything from me, and without making a production of it, and I sent you away with a train ticket and my life savings because I was afraid." "Silas," she said, "I am not finished," he said, and she heard something in it that was almost the ghost of the wry thing his voice sometimes did, and her heart turned over completely. "I have been practicing since the ridge." She pressed her lips together. "I thought sending you away was the decent thing," he said. "But you are sitting on your suitcase in front of the depot, which tells me you did not entirely agree, and I am grateful for it beyond what I know how to say." He took one step toward her and then stopped as though he wanted to close the distance, but understood that the distance was hers to cross or keep. "This cabin is not a home without you. It was a shelter before you came, and it has been a home since. And I did not know the difference until I sat in it alone for 1 hour with your coat on my chair and the fire gone out." He paused. "I am not a simple man to be near. I know that. I have a history this town will not let either of us forget, and I have a temper I keep on a short rope. And I am not easy with words in the ordinary course of things, as I think you may have noticed." "I had noticed," she said softly. "But I am asking you," he said, and now his voice had dropped to the register she had come to know as his truest one, the low and careful register he used when something mattered enough to be said precisely not to get on that train. "I am asking you to come back up the ridge with me, not as a cook, and not as someone who keeps the dust out, but as the person this whole situation has been moving toward from the moment you climbed into my wagon and asked what the hours were." He held her gaze. "I am asking you to let me be the man who earns what you already gave me freely. I do not deserve it yet, but I intend to." The train whistle sounded from the station closer, now the long note of arrival. Clara looked at him standing in the middle of the street in the full morning light, with his history and his scar and his hat in his hand, and no mask anywhere visible. And she thought about all the doors she had stood in front of and found closed, and she thought about the one she had opened herself on a cold morning 7 weeks ago when she walked into a strange man's cabin and rolled up her sleeves, and she thought about the coat on the chair and the wood box full before dawn and the flower in the tin cup on the windowsill and the evening. His voice had said, not the fire with that particular stiff and aching honesty. She picked up her suitcase. She saw something move in his face, something brace for impact, and she walked the 3 steps between them and held the suitcase out to him. "Then carry this," she said. "It is heavy." He looked at the suitcase. He looked at her face. Something happened in his expression that she had never seen there before. Something that broke through the last of everything he had built to keep the world at the appropriate distance. Something she could only describe later when she tried to find the words for it as the look of a man who has been in the dark a very long time and has just found light, not dramatic light, not the light of revelation, but the ordinary, steady, reliable light of a lamp in a window, the kind you can find your way home by. He took the suitcase from her hand. The street around them made a sound, a collected exhale, the sound of 30 or 40 people releasing breath they had not realized they were holding. She heard it, and it seemed to come from very far away because she was looking at Silas Kane's face, and it was the only thing in her field of vision that mattered. He offered her his arm, not with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to social gesture, but with the careful deliberateness of someone attempting a thing for the first time and determined to do it correctly. She put her hand through it, and his arm was solid under her hand, warm through the canvas of his coat, and they stood like that for a moment in the street in front of the depot of Red Hollow Creek. 2 people who had not been looking for anything and had found the most essential thing regardless. They walked, not toward the station, away from it up the main street toward the north end of town, where the roan was standing with the patient equanimity of a horse that has learned that its rider's errands are unpredictable but always eventually conclude. The crowd parted for them not with the fear-driven parting of Silas's arrival on the platform 7 weeks ago, but with something quieter and more complicated, the parting of people who are watching something they do not entirely understand, but recognize in some inarticulate way as true. Mrs. Aldridge was among them. Clara saw her on the boardwalk in front of the milliner's, standing with two other women, and she met the woman's eyes briefly and without hostility, because hostility required more energy than she currently had available. And in any case, the woman was irrelevant. The entire town was irrelevant. The only relevant things in the world at this moment were the arm beneath her hand and the road north toward the ridge. They reached the roan. Silas tied her suitcase to the back of the saddle with the efficient practicality of a man who has solved a logistical problem, and then he looked at the horse and at Clara and arrived at the obvious conclusion. "I will walk," he said. "You ride." "We will both walk," she said. "The horse has had enough for one morning." He looked at her for a moment. "It is a long way up the ridge on foot." "I walked it this morning," she said. "I am capable of walking it back." The ghost of the wry thing moved in his voice. "I know you are capable," he said. "I have been aware of that since you asked me what the hours were." She felt the warmth move through her chest again, the enormous, slow-moving thing, and she did not keep it behind glass this time. She let it move. It was hers. It had always been hers. She had simply been carrying it in the wrong room. They walked north out of Red Hollow Creek with the roan trailing behind them on a loose lead, and the town fell away at their backs, and the track began to rise toward the ridge, and the juniper and pinot closed around them again with their clean, astringent smell, and the territory opened up in all directions, red rock and pale sky, and the long, indifferent, magnificent distance of a land that had no opinion of them and never would. She told him on the walk up the ridge about sitting on her suitcase in front of the depot. "How long were you going to wait?" he asked. "I had not decided," she said. "As long as it took, I suppose." He was quiet for a moment. "And if I had not come?" She considered this honestly. "Then I would eventually have gotten on the train," she said, "because I am not a woman who destroys herself waiting for something that is not coming. But I would have waited a good while first." "How did you know I would come?" She looked at the track ahead of them, at the way it wound up between the rocks and the sparse trees toward the clearing she could not yet see but knew was there. "I did not know," she said. "I hoped. There is a difference." He absorbed this. "What made you hope?" She thought about the woodbox full before dawn. She thought about the bean seed. She thought about the evening he had sat by the fire after she had read to him and said that the woman in the book was harder on herself than anyone else was on her, and the look he had given her when she said that most people were. She thought about all the small, unannounced acts of care that had accumulated over 7 weeks into something that could not be mistaken for anything other than what it was. "You are not a man who does things by accident," she said. "And you did a great many things." He said nothing for a moment. Then quietly, "I did not think you had noticed all of it." "I noticed all of it," she said. He looked at her. She looked back at him. The roan walked along behind them with the sound of its hooves on the packed dirt, and the morning light fell through the trees in broken pieces, and the ridge rose ahead of them, patient and permanent. Holding the cabin on its shoulder, the way it had held it for 12 years, the whole time Silas had been building a life from consequence and calling it correctness. "The scar," she said after a while. Not as a question. "From the mine," he said. "When the tunnel came down, I went in. After, when they told me not to." He paused. "I had to see what I had done." She did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "And what did you see?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. "That it was too late," he said, "that there was nothing to do but know it and carry it." "You have carried it long enough," she said. "Clara." "I am not telling you to put it down," she said. "I am not so foolish as to think a person can simply decide to stop carrying a thing like that. I am saying that carrying it alone on a ridge away from everything is not the only way to carry it. You can carry it alongside someone. It does not get lighter, maybe. But it is a different kind of weight when someone knows you are carrying it and stays anyway. He stopped walking. She stopped too and turned to look at him. He was standing in the middle of the track with the roan behind him and the trees on either side, and the morning light full on his face, and he was looking at her with that expression she had first seen in the street, the one she could only describe as a man finding the light of a lamp in a window. "You intend to stay," he said. It was not quite a question. "I intend to stay," she said, clearly and without qualification. He breathed. It was a long breath, the kind that releases something that has been held for a very long time, and she watched it move through him, and she stayed where she was and let it complete. "Then we should discuss the terms," he said, and now there was something in his voice that was fully the right thing, no longer a ghost of it, and she felt it land in her chest like a gift she had not known to expect. "The terms," she said. "The original arrangement," he said, "was a cook and someone to keep the dust out, $1 a week when I have it." He held her gaze. "I think the terms require renegotiation." "I think so too," she said. "I am not a wealthy man," he said. "I have the cabin and the 40 acres and the roan and what I can grow and what I can earn from the work I can do. I have a history this town knows and will not soon forget. I am not easy with words in the common run of things, and I will make mistakes, and I will sometimes be wrong about which ones are worth admitting." He paused. "But I will not leave the wood box empty, and I will not let you go into that store alone again, and I will learn, if you are patient with me, to say the things I mean before I have held them long enough to make them difficult." Clara looked at him in the morning light on the track going up toward the ridge. "And what do you want in return?" she asked. He answered without hesitation, and the answer was simple enough and honest enough that it required no elaboration and received none. "Stay," he said. She crossed the 3 steps between them in the way she had crossed them at the depot, simply and without performance, and she took his free hand in both of hers, the way he had taken hers in the dark of the loft covering it, holding it. "The terms are acceptable," she said. They walked the rest of the way up the ridge in a quiet that had nothing difficult in it, the roan following behind them with its patient, amiable indifference. The morning turning toward noon, the territory opening up around them with its vast and beautiful unconcern. The cabin appeared around the last bend of the track, the way it always did without ceremony, set in its shallow clearing, with the garden behind it, and the new porch board, and the window that let in the afternoon light, and the stone hearth inside that had been cold when she left and would be warm again by evening. Silas opened the door, and she walked in. The coat was still on the arm of the chair where she had placed it, and the tin cup with the dried and fading flower was still on the windowsill, where it had been for nearly 2 weeks, and the shelves were organized in the logic she had established in her first days here, and the whole space had the quality she had tried and failed to name for herself. When she first felt it, the quality she now understood was simply home, which is not a place but an arrangement, a particular alignment of people and care and the willingness to stay. She unpacked her suitcase. She put her things back on the loft shelf and her sewing case on the window ledge and her books on the cleared space she had made on the second shelf in the first week. She came back down and built the fire because it was midday and not cold, but the fire needed lighting anyway, because the fire was how the cabin spoke to itself, how it said that someone was here and intended to remain. Silas stood in the doorway and watched her light it. "I should go check the east fence line," he said. "I left it this morning." "Go?" she said. "Supper will be ready when you come back." He did not move immediately. He stood in the doorway and looked at her. At the fire, she was coaxing to life at the room that was her room now as much as his, and she felt his attention on her back with the familiar warmth she had come to expect, and had been afraid for the space of one terrible hour that she would have to learn to live without. "Clara," he said. She looked up at him over her shoulder. He did not say anything more. He simply looked at her with his whole face open. Nothing armored, nothing held back, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was the thing she had been looking for since before she had words for it, the thing she had packed into her battered suitcase and carried across a continent on the stubborn, persistent hope that it existed somewhere, and that she had not been wrong to believe she deserved it. "Go check your fence," she said gently. He put on his hat. He went. She heard his boots on the new porch boards solid, and even not a wobble in it, and then his steps on the path, and then the quiet of the cabin settling around her like something that had been waiting patiently for her return and was now at last composed. The fire took hold. The light through the clean window fell across the floor in its long afternoon rectangle, and the garden outside the back wall was greening in its 2 careful rows, and the coat was on the chair, and the flower was on the sill, and the coffee pot was on the hook. And outside in the territory, the afternoon was wide and warm and indifferent and magnificent, and Clara Voss sat on the hearth of her own fire in her own home and listened to it burn. She was 27 years old. She had 32 cents and a garden, and a man who had ridden down a ridge without his hat to stand in the middle of a street and say true things in front of everyone who had already decided what he was, and she had a fire and a coat she had mended with her own hands and a window that let in the light. She had come west looking for a door that would finally open. She had found instead a man brave enough to walk through one. She let the fire warm her hands, and she let the afternoon be what it was, unhurried and sufficient, and she did not ask it to be anything more, because more was already on its way back down the east fence line and would be home before dark.